status quo, a dedication to constructive collaboration, and an unwavering zeal for discovery and exploration. These are the things Nobel Prizes are made of, and these are the very attributes that define Berkeley as this university's being one of society's most valuable assets. Call it a coincidence, but it was only last Friday when I joined Governor Newsom and leaders from California, the California legislature, to announce here at Berkeley that Berkeley will be the launch pad for Quantum California, the state's new effort to, one, support the best research facilities, two, to foster a quantum industry here in the state of California, and three, build the quantum workforce for the future. For a campus community dedicated to advancing the greater good, the promise of this science could not be more exciting. We can envision its benefits in fields like cybersecurity, drug discovery, new materials, scientific simulations, and other massive computing applications. Berkeley's ability to play an essential role in this initiative and similar ones across the scientific spectrum would not be possible without extraordinary scholars like John Clarke. Their work and discoveries in fundamental scientific research so often set the stage for the development of new technologies, products, and services that support the prosperity, health, and well-being of people around the world. Indeed, so often we cannot proceed to those things as a society until we understand the underlying mechanisms. John, on behalf of our university, I want to thank you for your contributions and accomplishments, and for helping to make Berkeley a quintessentially American institution, a place where we embrace and advance exploration, innovation, individuality, economic mobility, entrepreneurship, and freedom of thought and expression. There is one bit of bad news, however. As you may know, the members of our football team recently lit up the online world with a new decal on their helmets, the number 59, the number of Berkeley affiliates who had won the Nobel Prize as of last Saturday. Sorry, gentlemen, but your helmets are out of date. 60 is the new 59. Fiat Lux. Go Bears. I'll turn it over to Steve Kahn. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your comments.
Yeah, thanks, Rich, and congratulations, John. I've known John since I came to Berkeley as a graduate student in the late 70s, and then joined as a faculty member, as a colleague in the department in the 80s. I was present on campus when John and Michelle and John Martinez did these amazing experiments in the 80s. John Clarke is a treasure to our physics department at Berkeley. He's been a member of our faculty for the vast majority of his professional career. He is personally responsible for pioneering a large number of major developments in physics, several of which I think in the views of many of us are Nobel Prize worthy. But this particular set of experiments that John, Michelle, and John Martinez did in the 80s, I think were recognized by the Nobel Committee, partly because of what Rich said. They really pioneered the development of macroscopic quantum circuits that function like artificial atoms and have given rise to the technology that today is emerging as an enormous new industry for California and for the world, that of quantum information science and quantum computing. John not only pioneered this work in his own laboratories, but also trained an enormous number of students and postdocs who went on to themselves become leaders in the field, including Michel Devoret and John Martinez. So this is what we're proud of at Berkeley. We have outstanding and amazing scientists. We train fantastic postdocs and graduate students. And as Rich said, we look to lead the world with big ideas that give rise to the advances of tomorrow. And I can't think of a better example than this particular Nobel Prize work that we're so proud to honor today. So with that, let me turn it over to John.
First, Kara, I think Kara had something to say here before about questions.
Yes, welcome to all the media who are on the call. I will be monitoring the Q&A portion. So basically, if you could please keep yourself muted, and if you have a question, please drop your name and affiliation in the chat along with your question, and I'll call you to come off mute and ask your question of our Nobelist. Like Bob said, I will be adding a link to our press release and our media folder in the chat periodically. So please let me know if you would like to see that again. So to get started, John, could you tell us a little bit about what your morning was like? How did you find out about the news, and how do you feel about it?
Well, I received a phone call at 2:09 my morning. And I thought, well, this is obviously a junk call and maybe I shouldn't bother to answer it. But in the end, I decided to pick up the phone. And then a voice from Sweden introduced himself and said that he was calling to congratulate me that I had shared the 2005 Nobel Prize in physics. And I wasn't quite sure at the beginning whether or not this was a sort of a junk call, but it turned out, it soon became clear that it was real. And so they spent a lot of time explaining the call, and pointed out that I would, of course, with my two colleagues, be invited to the Nobel Prize ceremony on December the 10th. And so it went on. And I was sitting there just feeling completely stunned. It had never occurred to me in my entire life that anything like this would ever happen. But then they interviewed me for a while and asked me just a bunch of questions, I think, for their information as much as anything else. And so it went on. And at the end of all this, well, I thanked them profusely and said that I was deeply honored, of course, to receive the Nobel Prize, which I had never expected. And so after maybe 30 or 40 minutes, the conversation came to an end. And then very shortly afterwards, I started to get email. And then I had people banging on my door wanting to interview me. I think the first time was at 3 in the morning. There was someone banging on my door. And I said, no, thank you, not at this time of night. But subsequently, later in the morning, then I answered these calls and had a discussion. But at the same time, email was pouring in. And I had never realized that people in the Bay Area were reading their email at 3 in the morning and 4 in the morning and 5 in the morning. And this email just poured in. And I haven't really had a chance even to look at it all, but I must have received close to 1,000 emails today. And I'm not quite sure. Well, it's going to be hard to reply to all of those. The person I was most happy to receive an email from was Brian Josephson. And Brian Josephson won the Nobel Prize many years ago now for the invention of Josephson tunneling. And Brian was in the same lab as I was, overseen by Brian Pippard, later Sir Brian Pippard. And I got to know him very well. And he had invented Josephson tunneling, which has led to innumerable number of applications in various forms. And my thesis advisor said, well, John, this is what you should be working on. And the same thesis advisor, Brian Pippard, gave me that advice. But unfortunately, it wasn't possible to make thin film Josephson junctions. And the first Josephson junctions had actually being created with thin films, and we didn't have a thin film technology. And so all this went on, and this enabled me to invent different kinds of devices that were not made out of thin films. And I think the most important of these was the SQUID, the superconducting quantum interference device, which was invented by a group in Chicago. And so I potted away and I made these devices that were not made out of thin films. And eventually one of them actually worked. And it was called the SLUG, the superconducting low inductance undulatory galvanometer. And that's what really got me going in my career. And I think a lot of this was due to the fact that Brian Josephson was in the same building and he was always talking to me and giving me advice.
That's wonderful. Yeah, one of the great things about the Nobels is it really brings people together around science and being interested in science. Jana Katayama at KTVU, you have a question. Could you unmute yourself and ask your question?
Yes, I do. Thank you, Cara. And congratulations to you, Professor Clarke. Thank you for doing this. I just wanted to ask you personally, you know, we've seen a lot about the work that you did, but I just wanted to ask you about your own research and your approach to it. Were there ever any times when you were frustrated with your research or came up against challenges? And from that, do you have any advice to young people who might be really inspired to pursue research and science about how to work through those challenges?
Well, I think the simple answer to that is you have to keep trying. Of course, you have to have some conviction, either from your thesis advisor or from your own energy, that this is possible. But I think that there are very few projects that I started on that, in fact, I completely gave up on. And I think it's a question of trial and error and patience and understanding if it doesn't work, why it doesn't work.
Thank you. Seth Bornstein at the Associated Press, you had a question. Could you unmute yourself and ask a question?
Yes, thank you very much for doing this, and congratulations, Dr. Clarke. In your when you spoke with the a Swedish Academy this morning, you mentioned cell phones as an application. Can you explain, trying to use as much layman language as possible, as how your work translated into the cell phone technology we've seen? And in terms of, is there more hope for the future than what we've actually seen so far? In other words, especially with quantum computing, is there far more promise ahead than what we've already seen from your work?
Well, I think to answer that question, I have to say a little bit about what we did. And the citation from the Nobel Prize Committee was for the discovery of macroscopic quantum tunneling and energy quantization in an electrical circuit. Now, that sounds like a very complicated sentence or statement, but one can break it down into pieces. And for example, when we talk about energy quantization, this is something that we all learn about in rather elementary physics. For example, the hydrogen atom. We learn about the structure of the hydrogen atom. And what we learn is that the electron in a hydrogen atom, or the electrons in bigger atoms, can have energy levels. But they're not just random energy levels. The energy levels are quantized so that they have very specific values. And for example, in rather elementary physics in university, we learned that how to calculate the quantization. So the idea of quantization is actually quite well known. Now, the other part of the citation talks about macroscopic quantum tunneling. And again, this is something that we all learn about. And for example, a good example of that is Josephson tunneling. Again, talking about my colleague in the Cambridge physics department. And the idea there is that a pair of electrons can tunnel through a barrier. And the probability of doing that is something that in principle is calculable. But all of these tunneling procedures are for single electrons or pairs of electrons. And what Michel Deveray and John Martinez and I figured out is that if you design the circuit properly, then you could actually have tunneling of very large objects. And that's where the macroscopic tunneling comes from. And that's the thing, combined with the energy quantization, that in the end won us the Nobel Prize. That we had understood that procedure, and we had in particular understand how to calculate it. And this is 40 years ago. And all this came about in due course, not in a year or two, but over the years, that this sort of process is in fact part of our phone system. My iPhone basically works on that procedure. Also, there's an enormous effort now to generate various quantum devices that are leading to all kinds of very important informations, not the least of which is the quantum computer. And there's an enormous effort now to sort of develop all those procedures.
Yeah, it's really exciting what these are leading to. I know that the experiments that led to this Nobel Prize were conducted at Berkeley. Could you talk a little bit about what role UC Berkeley played in the discovery?
Well, first of all, it employed me. So that was the first requirement. It provided me with a lot of lab space. And so under typical circumstances for the first many years of my career, I had enough laboratory space to employ something like a 10 or even a dozen graduate students and postdocs. And so they provided the space for them. It turns out that in the first many years of my career, I actually got my research funding from the Lawrence Berkeley National Lab. And they, as the years went on, they provided larger and larger amounts of money that both supported my group, but also provided the research funding. And for example, as time went on, I started to need more and more expensive equipment of various types. For example, a dilution refrigerator, which is a rather expensive thing, but this enables one to cool down devices to tens of millikelvin under appropriate circumstances. And all this worked very well. And so all this was in the framework, not of the Lawrence Berkeley lab so much, but of the physics department on campus. And they provided the resources to do that. And of course, I was also teaching every semester, except when I was on sabbatical leave, I would teach a course. And so all this was in parallel to my research. And so it was quite a lot of work, but it was, to me, incredibly engaging. I enjoyed teaching, but I really did my best to look after my students and postdocs. And I had this sort of policy that I would try to talk to each of my students and postdocs every day. Maybe only just to stop by the lab and say, how's it going? But I just wanted to make sure that people were sort of content with what they were doing. And sometimes the projects they were working on were also very demanding and very, very complicated. But I just wanted to make sure that they sort of were on top of things.
That's great. Maggie Donaldson at the AFP, could you unmute yourself and ask your question?
Hi there, and thanks so much. Congratulations. Most of the Nobel winners thus far this year have been based in the US, and that comes at a moment that there is a lot of concern and fear over like a loss of federal funding in the sciences, but throughout academia. And I wonder if you have any thoughts on that and the importance of federal funding to research such as your own.
This is an immensely serious problem. And I certainly know personally people who've lost most of their funding. And this will cripple much of the United States science research unless they reverse this procedure. And for example, it's not just physics. For example, the NIH, National Institutes of Health, have taken enormous hits in their funding for reasons that are entirely beyond any understanding that any of us have. But this is going to cripple science, and it is going to be disastrous. And if this continues, assuming that the present administration finally comes to an end, it may take a decade to get back to where we were, say, half a year ago. I think it's a huge problem, which, as I said, is entirely beyond any understanding of anyone who's a scientist.
Yeah, thank you. Katrina Miller at the New York Times, could you unmute yourself and ask your question?
Hi there. Congratulations on your prize today. Sort of a follow-up question to that. What really strikes me about this discovery is that it is awarded for very fundamental work that has led to so many different everyday applications, but that were at the time, maybe those applications you and your team didn't foresee. And so I'm curious what your thoughts are on the importance of pursuing basic research questions like this, even if there is no clear direct societal benefit.
I think it's absolutely vital because so many crucial applications originate in the basic science, and understanding that. And another example to come back to is Josephson tunneling. I mean, when Josephson invented the Josephson effect, there were actually eminent theoretical scientists who said, this is all nonsense. There's no way that this is possible. And I think that it's so important to do this basic science because you don't know what the outcome is going to be. I mean, some outcomes are more important than others, but you don't know. And for example, Michelle and John and I had no way of understanding the importance of this effect that actually led to our Nobel Prize. If you'd asked us 40 years ago, we would have said, well, yeah, it's an interesting thing. We're glad to have done this and we understand it, and move on. And you just don't know how it's going to evolve because other people will pick up on the idea and develop it. And I think it's very crucial to understand that the people who invent something, like Josephson tunneling, are not the people who actually use that effect to do something that is vitally important. And that's why you have to keep on trying to do this very basic science because you just don't know what's going to come out of it. I mean, another example might be magnetic resonance imaging, just to go to an entirely different field. That I think that when this was first developed, people thought, well, it's an interesting thing. But ultimately, this is an incredibly important clinical tool that is used around the world.
Yeah, thank you. Really important to highlight basic research. Kai Lee from KTSF, could you unmute yourself and ask your question?
Hello, Professor Clarke. Congratulations. I have a question. Given the it's a bit noisy in my background. Given the transformative impact of your work on macroscopic quantum tunneling, what area of quantum technology or fundamental physics are you excited to explore next?
You're asking why did we decided to do that?
Yes, and what is the next step?
Well, I think we've seen the next step, which has been going on for 40 years. I think that, I don't know, Michelle and John and I were sort of pottering around and thinking about, well, what should we do next? And we started to think about whether it was possible to make experiments that depended on just the tunneling of, say, a single particle or two particles of electrons. Is it something we could do to engage that in a way that would make it applicable to large-scale systems? And it was just something we talked about for a long time. I mean, we go out and have lunch and we would just say, well, you know, is this worth doing? If so, how would we do it? And do we know how to design the circuit? Which is not trivial, by the way. And this eventually led to this invention. First of all, we had to understand how it was going to work, and then we had to fabricate it. And I had a lot of quite sophisticated equipment in my lab, fortunately, because I had been well funded through the Lawrence Berkeley lab. And so we had to have a means to lower the temperature, as I said previously, to some very low temperatures. But we also had to have the means to develop these thin film circuits, which were not trivial. But we had enough experience from our previous research to know how to do that.
Thank you. Leah Worthington at California Magazine, could you unmute yourself and ask your question?
Yes, thank you so much, and congratulations. I work for California Magazine at Berkeley, and so I just want to pick up on a thread that Kara started. I'm curious if you think, you talked a little bit about resources and financial support. I'm curious if you think there's something unique about the culture or environment at institutions like particularly Berkeley that facilitate research like yours and like your fellow winners.
Yes, well, we have a lot of resources from people who help us to do things, not necessarily scientists and certainly not faculty. But for example, we had a very important workshop back in those days where you could go and fabricate things if you knew how to do that. And in fact, just today, I was walking along one of the corridors to see some other people, and two of these gentlemen came by and congratulated me. And they said, we're so happy that you were able to win the Nobel Prize today. I was very touched that people who were not faculty members and not scientists, but nonetheless were very glad that I was able to win the Nobel Prize. And I didn't actually say it and they didn't say it, but this whole background of people who help you to do things really have an enormous impact on how things work out. And they taught me how certainly in my earlier days as a beginning professor, they taught me how to make things in the workshop. And I think that this culture of having not only just the scientists and the faculty working together, but you have this whole background of people. Also, I mean, just as another example that's absolutely crucial, there are people who have to take care of the funding. And they have to make sure that, you know, my funds don't run out before they're supposed to. And they have to help me submit proposals for the funding and so on. And I think that one of the things that has made the Berkeley Physics Department such a great place to work is the fact that we have this enormous amount of support. And I think that that's absolutely crucial. I think without that level of support, none of us would be able to do what we do.
Thank you. I think I'm going to get two more questions from the chat and then we'll wrap up. First, Katrina Miller, you had a follow-up.
I did, thank you. I'm curious if you have been able to get in touch with your co-laureates and if what have you guys said, if so?
So yes, because I think I said this, that they were not able to join the call. And I think it's because they were fast asleep at 2 o'clock in the morning. And I talked to one of them, he says, well, he always muted his cell phone at night. But that was Michel Devery. And so after I finished the call, I immediately emailed them and said that, you know, I have great news for you. And the two of you and I have shared the Nobel Prize in physics today. And so Michel got back to me. He called me, I think it was probably around 6 o'clock or so, and said, you know, he was thrilled out of his mind, of course, and he was sorry he was not able to join the call with the Swedish Academy. And subsequently, I received an email from John Martinez, who was already tied up, I think, with other responses to the announcement of this prize. And he said, let's talk again later this afternoon. And so I will certainly talk to John. And just to make a very important statement, this Nobel Prize would not possibly have happened without all the work and all the insights that Michel and John had. And I in principle was the leader of the group, but the fact is that their contributions were absolutely vital and important. And as they just said, we would never have got this prize if they hadn't done all their hard work.
Thank you. All right, final question. Julia Sulek, San Jose Mercury News.
Yes, hello, and congratulations. Would you mind giving one more go at explaining how your discovery ultimately led to the iPhone?
Well, that's a complicated question. It's because this discovery, the idea of macroscopic quantum tunneling and energy quantization, can be used to make very sophisticated things that would not otherwise be possible to work out. You wouldn't be able to, I think you wouldn't have an iPhone today, and you certainly wouldn't have anything that looks like a quantum computer today, unless you had this discovery, because that enabled you to make things that originally we thought of. You know, if you go back something like 100 years, that's when, first of all, quantum mechanics was invented. And quantum mechanics for decades was clearly really the subject of atoms. And the fact that our discovery enabled this to be applicable to something that you can consider to be, you know, a giant atom, a gigantic atom. And that's what made all this other technology possible. And for example, you know, if you think about quantum computing, it's quantum, but a computer is a very complicated device. And so if you can make it work at a quantum level, that's a real advance.
Thank you. And maybe to end on a lighter note, or at least a slightly less complicated note, how do you plan to celebrate this afternoon?
Well, we're going to have a department party at 3 o'clock. And I don't quite know the details of that beyond where it's going to be held. And I'm sure that there will be enormous numbers of faculty and graduate students there and postdocs. And so that's scheduled to be at 3 o'clock. And I'm particularly happy to say that my my daughter, who lives in San Francisco with her family, I have 2 grandsons, she's going to join that event. And I'm so happy that she's able to join us. And I think all my colleagues will also be very, very happy to see her.
Thank you, Professor Clarke. Thanks to everyone in the audience for their great questions. And thanks to Chancellor Lyons and Dean Kahn. And again, I want to remind you that if you need images or video, please check the folders that in Google Drive that were pasted in the chat. And if you have any other questions, you can email us in the news office, especially me and Kara, who will respond very quickly. And with that, I'd like to bring this to a close. And again, congratulations, Professor Clarke, on winning the Nobel Prize today.
Thank you so much, and thank you for arranging this event.
Goodbye, everybody.
Bye. Wow. 15 minutes became 40 minutes.
Hard to do it that quickly, isn't it? That was great.
Hey, John,
Yeah.
you can turn off your favorite light now.
Well, you put it high enough because I was looking at the screen. That wasn't a problem. Sorry.
Get you something else.
Yeah, I think
You can take
Recording stopped.